Snow White might be Disney's worst remake yet, but it's not because of the casting or the CGI or the story. Although there are problems with all of those things, it's the worst because it's such a sad reflection of one of the most historic films of Disney's legacy. In 1937, Snow White saved Disney from bankruptcy. It was the studio's first full-length feature film, and it pioneered animation as a viable, long-form filmmaking style. Without Snow White, none of your favorite animated movies would exist. Out of all the Disney remakes, Snow White is the one that should have the most artistic integrity. Instead, it's so uninspired and completely forgetful and visually disappointing. On top of all of the drama that surrounded this movie's release, all of this has led to the second worst opening weekend Disney has had for a theatrical remake. Yes, it's even worse than Dumbo. Snow White is not the worst movie ever, but it is a bad adaptation. So let me tell you where I think they went wrong. From the story to the music to the visuals, there will be spoilers for pretty much everything. Although I don't know if that matters too much because it looks like no one is going to see this movie anyway. Overall, I don't think that Snow White works because it feels like a new story rather than an adaptation of the classic animation. The main beats are there. Snow White wishes at a well. The queen orders a huntsman to kill her out of jealousy for her beauty, but he can't because she's too kind. Snow escapes to a cottage, befriends the dwarves that live there, is tricked with a poisoned apple, and awoken from death with a kiss. But the surrounding story is so disconnected or needlessly changed. There were so many opportunities to build out the characters from the animation or to spend more time on certain scenes. Instead, we get several new songs and new characters that don't really add anything interesting, and all of these pointless new additions make the movie feel so rushed, but then at the same time, really boring. And that's because to get through a lot of the plot, they resort to telling and not showing, which is a sign of poor writing. There are so many times that Snow White talks about how great her parents were before they died.
But when I was young, my parents and we'd pick apples.
My parents always said this forest was a magical place. When I was a little girl, my mother taught me how to whistle.
But we never see any of it. This is actually something that Snow White and the Huntsman, which is an older Snow White film, does pretty decently. We actually have scenes with Snow White as a little girl interacting with her parents and interacting with the evil queen when she marries her father. It's so much easier to get invested in Snow White's story because you're actually experiencing it, not just being told it. So let's get into the specifics, and I want to do this by going through each character, starting with Snow White. I think the biggest problem with Snow White's character is that this Snow White just doesn't feel like Disney's Snow White, which I think is a shame because there are a couple other Snow White movies that came out several years ago which had to be so different from Disney's Snow White that this would have been a really fun opportunity to finally see the live action version of the Snow White we often think about. Snow White has always been a very gentle, sweet, and ingenue character, and I will give them credit because they try to keep Snow very naive, but she still comes off as a lot more bold. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a more bold princess at all, but that's just not who Disney's Snow White is. And I think where we see this the most is in Snow White's wish. Snow White wishes to lead like her parents instead of wishing for love to rescue her. Normally, I don't love the lover turned leader trope in a remake, but after rewatching the animation, I think this actually could have worked, even for a gentler, sweeter character. They just don't do it well. And the first reason why is because they don't establish the reason behind Snow White's internal struggle. So let me break this down for you. As a kid, Snow White's father tells her that she'll grow up to lead the kingdom in a fair way, and he gives her a necklace inscribed with the words, fearless, fair, brave, and true. Which, by the way, who could forget the Mulan remake where she's given a sword with the words, loyal, brave, and true.
Loyal, brave, and true.
And you're telling me you couldn't come up with two different words that weren't brave and true? Not to mention that some of these words don't even make much sense because bravery is having courage in the face of fear, which you cannot do if you are also fearless. But anyway, So her dad gives her this necklace, then her mom dies, and then her dad remarries, and then he dies, and she's stuck serving the evil queen. When Snow grows up, Snow wishes she could lead like her father. But my question is, why does she doubt that she can't? Is she simply just naturally obedient? Has the queen threatened or manipulated her? Does she feel inferior to her father's amazing leadership? Jonathan, who is a commoner bandit, and who Snow White finds stealing potatoes from their kitchen, makes a lot of sense. He asks her, why doesn't the princess talk to the queen? Why is Snow waiting all of this time? At least in Snow White and the Huntsman, Snow White was actually imprisoned, and she physically couldn't do anything. The main reason why this is so confusing is because Snow wishes to be fearless, but she is never, at any time, scared. In the beginning of the movie, Snow White asks the queen to show kindness and mercy to Jonathan, who is caught for stealing, and she has no fear doing it.
Something small, something sweet even can make you believe that there's more to being alive than mere subsistence.
And then the rest of the movie, she practices bravery. She releases Jonathan behind the queen's back, who is tied up for stealing. She stays with the bandits to fight off the queen's men, and she calmly questions the huntsman, who literally tries to kill her. Snow White never learns to overcome her fear because she is already fearless. And that's why it's so confusing why Snow White is waiting on a wish and doubts herself. There is no reason that she should. It also doesn't show that Snow White grows, which was a huge opportunity to do in this remake because Snow White doesn't really grow in the animation. I think if it were up to me, instead of wishing for the courage to lead, which doesn't make any sense in this case, or for love to rescue her, which I do think is quite passive, and I don't mind, by the way, that in the original she wishes for love because I do think that's sweet and very relatable. I just mean that it should be a complement to a personal goal. So I think she could have wished for a fulfilling life to help her suffering people and to grow herself beyond the walls of this prison-like castle, which could include finding love. In this version, Snow wouldn't stand up to the queen all of this time because she would actually be afraid of her. Perhaps the queen often uses violence against her or her animal friends because the queen would actually be evil, which she's not in this version, and we're going to get into that later. And I think Snow White would still doubt that she's fit to lead, but for a logical reason. Perhaps she doesn't believe she's as strong as her noble father. He is lifted up so much in this movie as a fantastic leader, and maybe she really does feel inferior to that. But maybe she can't bring herself to leave just yet because she's nursing the queen's mistreated animals, which would be a callback to helping the bird in the original. Or maybe she's helping the other mistreated maids. She wouldn't be able to leave them for a better life for herself because she's fair. It wouldn't be until she's forced to leave by escaping the huntsman ordered to kill her that she grows into her own. She'd learn with the dwarves that she is actually a great leader because of her softness. Leadership comes in many forms, not just like the noble strength of her father's. It's because Snow White doesn't want power that makes her best suited for it. People naturally like her. She brings joy to even the grumpiest of beings, and she is a great project manager. I actually do think a leadership storyline would have worked so well for Snow White because if you watch the original animation, she is a fantastic leader. She does not put up with any nonsense.
March straight outside and wash, or you'll not get a bite to eat.
She stops corruption.
Not under the rug.
She delegates work fairly.
Now you wash the dishes, you tidy up the room, you clean the fireplace, and I'll use the broom.
She's kind to those who are different than her, and she makes all personality types feel cared for. And even though she's very sweet and gentle, she could also be stern too. And that's something I really missed in this version, is her sassiness.
Oh, you must be grumpy.
Yes, in the original, she really does sound like a mom, and like all the men are super clueless, which is not great. And that's why it would have been the perfect opportunity to keep her qualities and update the context, just in a way that made actual sense. On top of the fact that she's born brave without learning to be, another key problem with her character is that her fairness is also explored poorly. In the remake, fairness is about equal treatment of others, not beauty, established by the fair way the king and queen rule the kingdom. So Snow White's beauty isn't really referenced in the film, and I understand where they're coming from. I really do. You know, beauty is more than skin deep. I get it. I actually really like that Snow White's true fairness is her goodness. The problem is that it just does not make sense for this story that we don't ever reference her beauty, because the queen is vain. And she is supposed to be threatened by Snow White's looks. For the queen's actions to make any sense against Snow, people do have to think that Snow White is conventionally attractive as well. And I think avoiding that whole plot point, even though I know it had good intentions, it does make it a bit more confusing. Though I'm not surprised that no one talks about her beauty because of this horrendous wig that Rachel Zegler did not deserve. She is a stunning woman, but we're gonna get into that later. I did only see this movie once, and I could be misremembering. There could be some times when they do talk about her beauty, but it is significantly less than the original. But even with more focus on her personality, Snow actually seems more selfish than fair at times. For example, when the huntsman can't kill her, she becomes lost in the forest and the animals lead her to a cottage. Snow essentially just lets herself in and immediately goes to sleep. And it just seemed so entitled and self-serving, because in the original, Snow White actually has very sound reasoning for trespassing. She thinks orphaned children live there and they don't have a mom. That's why it's such a mess. And she thinks, oh, you know what I can do? I can clean the place. And in exchange, maybe they'll let me sleep here. And it's only after all her hard work that she decides to take a nap. This to me makes so much more sense. Also different in this version is that when the dwarves find her, they straight up offer her housing because she's the princess, aside from Grumpy because he doesn't trust her. And I think that this is so much less endearing than in the original, because in the original, she actually wins the dwarves over by thoughtfully guessing all their names, and she makes a selfless bargain.
And if you let me stay, I'll keep house for you.
I didn't really get the sense that Snow White really bonded with the dwarves in the same way. While I wish Snow did something for the dwarves as an act of kindness or payment for sleeping there, I actually do really like that she gets the dwarves to clean this time. Whistle While You Work was actually my favorite part in the movie. She realizes that the dwarves fight a lot, so she helps them work together and clean up their own mess. Also different than the original is that Snow White leaves the dwarves to find her father, because when the huntsman let her go, he told her that the queen lied about her father dying in battle all those years ago. But this addition is so pointless because the lie is actually that he's dead by murder, and it barely affects her when she finds out. And I wonder why they didn't make her new goal once she gets to the dwarves' house to help the dwarves and the humans work together, especially because the dwarves distrust humans so much. And I think that goal would really show her leadership qualities even more, instead of going on some self-serving journey that doesn't lead anywhere. I don't mind that this is an updated remake and that there are new storylines, but I can't help but think that at what point should we just make a new story and a new character? While I do think that a lot of her fairness isn't really well represented in the movie, there are a couple of really good examples that I did actually really like. So for example, when Snow White sees that Dopey is bullied by the others, she takes him in and she teaches him how to whistle. And I actually thought this was a really sweet scene, and I did really like how they worked whistling into the movie, giving it a lot more significance than the original. It actually helps Dopey find his voice, which I think is really sweet. And I also really liked that Snow White didn't use violence to overthrow the evil queen. Instead, she helped people remember the good times by remembering their names. I thought that was really refreshing and very suitable for Snow White's goodness. Although, if that's really all it took, I'm not sure why she couldn't have done that while she was mopping up the place, but anyway. And then the last thing on this fairness topic, in the OG Snow White, when the evil queen is defeated, Snow White is the rightful heir to that kingdom. And then she marries the prince, so she becomes the queen of that kingdom. So in the original movie, Snow White is technically ruler of two kingdoms, and she does not get as sweet of a deal in this movie, which if you ask me, is kind of unfair. Aside from her goal and her personality, as with most updated princesses, Snow White also has no flaws. Things come very easy to her. Like, for example, when the hunter tries to kill her in a surprise attack, she is barely frightened, and she has the brain capacity to ask about his motivations. In the animation, Snow White is actually quite strong, but it's not because she doesn't have fear. It's because she was resilient in the face of fear, and she took herself out of her own fears by caring for others that were afraid. And that's another thing I missed in this movie, is that she actually doesn't have to befriend any of the woodland animals. They all just like her immediately. But in the animation, she actually scares them and she has to win them over. Snow White is also immediately suspicious when the disguised evil queen presents her with an apple. The evil queen does manipulate her to take it, and she takes a bite, but it does make this a lot less believable because she was wary from the beginning. In the animation, Snow White is not perfect. Her fatal flaw is that she sees goodness in everyone, even when she probably shouldn't. The old witch is supposed to take advantage of Snow's innocence and optimism. And yes, you could argue that Snow should have been a little smarter and known about stranger danger, especially when the dwarves warned her about it, but her good heart just wanted to help a sick old woman. And you just don't get that same deep emotional sense of goodness in the live action, which I think is really, really important, because even though Snow White doesn't save herself in the animation, it's still her impact, her goodness towards other people and beings that saves her. And it shows that all goodness, whether direct or indirect, will conquer evil. Also, speaking of apples, maybe it's just me, but I was expecting there to be so much more apple symbolism in this movie. But apart from eating a poisoned apple, the only time apples are ever associated with Snow White is when she gives the huntsman an apple as an act of kindness when he takes her to go apple picking. But this is very odd because there are apples literally everywhere in this orchard, and it's not like this huntsman is starving. I don't know why this is such a brave act of kindness. He could have easily picked an apple himself. Maybe if Snow White gave the huntsman the best apple or the last apple, that would make a lot more sense. And also, aren't the apples supposed to be some sort of symbol of life and goodness? In which case, wouldn't it have made sense if the evil queen poisoned the apple orchards and she stopped things from growing? And then maybe you see Snow White working in the gardens where the well is, where she wishes all the time, because while the queen killed everything off, Snow White is out here making the good things grow within the castle walls. Maybe Snow White would tend to the last apple tree solely for the queen's benefit, and this would hint at the queen's greed, and it would also hint at Snow White being a good leader because she can plant and tend to healthy roots, making a good foundation and helping things flourish even among life-threatening weeds. And then also, wouldn't it have made more sense for Jonathan to have been stealing apples and not potatoes? I know apples would spoil quicker, but just symbolically. And then it would have been kind of sweet because stealing these apples is only possible because Snow White actually made those apples grow. And then you would actually establish this evil queen as really evil because she would be taking a symbol of growth and goodness and health and poisoning it for others. Speaking of Jonathan, we do indeed get a love story, which I was really worried that they were going to cut if you saw my Disney Love video. So really happy that there is a love interest, but very disappointed that this love story isn't good. Jonathan is some sort of commoner turned bandit. He's out for himself, and he kind of feels like this Flynn Rider type of character, which I say lightly because I love Flynn Rider, and he is not him. And I don't like this because Snow White's prince was always this very charming man, and I kind of would have liked to see that sort of sweet, charming relationship because I feel like that's more Snow White's style. And maybe it does make sense that he is more selfish and out for himself and he learns from Snow White to be fair, but they don't really show that in the movie at all. They do end up falling in love, but they get separated and Jonathan is captured by the evil queen. Meanwhile, Snow is poisoned by the apple, but don't worry, he escapes prison pretty fast. However, he's motivated to go back to Snow White because she fought with him against the queen's army or whatever at one point when she didn't need to. But I feel like it should have been Snow White's goodness and her resilience, not her fighting, that drew him back to her. I think they really needed some vulnerable moments together, which I think you could have easily done by cutting out this entire Princess Problems song. I would have expected that the kiss would have been really emotional, a really dramatic moment, but they don't build up the relationship between these two, so it kind of feels a little bit empty. But I guess the one good thing is that they do have now direct consent to kiss each other, because that was one of the lines in the songs. let's talk about the evil queen, because this was just not it. The evil queen, of course, is the villain of the story, and she turns a once fair kingdom into a sad one and hoards all the resources for herself. I think the biggest issue with the evil queen is that she is not scary at all. When I first saw this movie as a kid, I thought it was the scariest movie I had ever seen. However, it made me a stronger person. I just think that the kids these days, they just don't live through the same trauma, and I think they need it, and I would have put in a scary witch. But, I wouldn't have obviously made it too scary. If I had to go through it when I was 4 years old, if the kids these days can also do it, I would even go so far as to say it's only fair. Speaking of which, why on earth is this queen obsessed with being fair? I can't believe they did not write a backstory for her. I mean, that is the most easy thing you can do for a remake. So not only do we not know why this queen is so obsessed with being fair, the entire plot around being, quote, the fairest of them all makes even less sense. Because in the original, fair is equated to beauty, both internal and external. And as Snow White grows up, she grows into her beauty. And so that's why one day she ends up being the fairest of them all. But in this version, fair means literal fairness and ruling justly, which makes no sense, because if that's the case, how on earth is the queen ever fair? She hoards all the wealth for herself, she treats Snow White poorly, and leaves a petty thief to die alone in the cold. And then in addition to her motivations, the queen's belief system doesn't make any sense either. Why does the queen believe that beauty means power? Now, I assume she's talking about pretty privilege, but not one time do they explore that after the king marries her. Yet she keeps bringing it up. She talks about diamonds and power and beauty like 50 times. And I'm like, okay, I get that you think that beauty is power, but like, how is beauty power right now? And then side note to that, by the way, whenever she brings up her diamond, she's also comparing Snow White to a rose, which irked me just a little bit, because you could have easily compared her to an apple. Me back to the apples, which I like better because a rose is so often associated with Belle, and it's just been done before. And like, she'd be like, well, an apple rots, but a diamond always stays the same. But then, an apple rots and it becomes fertilizer, and then there's a seed and then a tree grows. But like, a diamond is just like a diamond. What can you do with a diamond? You know what I mean? So we've got her belief system doesn't make sense. Her motivations don't make sense. Her whole character just does not make sense. But also her actions don't make sense. Because why does the queen even keep Snow White all this time? I mean, I guess this is a problem in the original too. But if she murdered her dad, she could have easily done the same to Snow White. So why does she keep her as a maid? Because surely with all the diamonds she has, she could hire any maid. And I think they should have established, like, maybe the evil queen just really enjoys seeing Snow White to be miserable. Like, this girl who could be really beautiful is just in rags and looks horrible, and like, that just makes her happy. Or maybe you do something similar to Snow White and the Huntsman, where the queen needs Snow White specifically for something. And I also would have loved more insight into her actions. Like, I would have loved to know what she told Snow White when she gave her this really beautiful dress and was like, go pick apples. It's actually quite jarring in the animation, and this would have been a great opportunity to explore that. Also, another ridiculous thing that makes no sense. When she asks the huntsman to kill Snow White, she gives him a box and she says, bring me her heart. And the huntsman doesn't kill her, but he brings her back the box. And I thought it was so ridiculous how she goes to the mirror and asks him who is the fairest of them all. And he says it's Snow White. And she's like, it's impossible. Her heart is in this box. And she opens it up, and inside the box is an apple. And I genuinely thought to myself, does this queen have a brain? I don't know how she slithered her way to the top of the power chain in this kingdom. And she didn't think to check the box to make sure the huntsman did his job. In the original, she knows in the box that there is a heart, but she doesn't know that it's a pig's heart. And that makes so much more sense, rather than her just never opening the box. And then at the very end, her death is her own doing. She breaks the mirror, and then the mirror sucks her in. And again, I like that there was no violence involved and Snow White didn't specifically kill her. But then this just leads to more questions. Is she trapped in the mirror? Is she fully dead? Is the mirror still creepy? I mean, what's going on in there? I also thought, even though I like that there wasn't any violence, it to be a little bit unsatisfying because she ends herself rather than it being good conquering evil. And then for the last of the characters, we have the dwarves and we have the bandits, who really aren't characters at all because they're hardly in the movie. The first thing I thought when I saw these dwarves is that they look like they are out of the Polar Express movie, and I've heard a lot of people say that, so it's been very validating. I'm glad we all agree. They're just very uncanny valley looking, and it's quite odd. Overall, the dwarves are very flat and, sad to say, but kind of boring characters. You really only get to know Doc, Grumpy, and Dopey, but in the original, there are a few more moments with more of the dwarves, like Sneezy and Bashful and Sleepy. Like I said, I did really like that Dopey learns to whistle. I do think he could have stopped at the whistling, but he's really one of the only dwarves to learn anything. Even Grumpy doesn't have much of an arc. I actually really think that it should have been Grumpy to shoot the queen or to do something to take the queen down, even if it's not to directly kill her, because he has a really great arc in the original where he is so against Snow White, but then he becomes the one to lead the charge against the evil queen. It was also odd that their mining didn't get a backstory either, which, by the way, kind of conflicts with the queen's obsession with gems, does it not? Because the queen hoards gems because she's greedy. The dwarves also mine gems, so are they just as greedy? It would have been cool if they gave a reason why the dwarves were mining gems, but it was for a good cause. They also have powers of some sort, but it isn't developed. The dwarves also really distrust humans, and I would have loved that conflict to play out a little bit more. Overall, the dwarves really do feel like an afterthought, although it's not surprising because I think they literally were an afterthought, given that the 7 magical creatures or bandits were supposed to be in the dwarves' place. I was actually really surprised to see these characters in the movie. I thought that they would actually be completely written out of the story, but instead it seems like they just squished the 2 stories together. And as a result, we don't really know enough about the dwarves, and then we barely know anything about these bandits. And the bandits and the dwarves barely bond together, which means that the dwarf storyline about trusting humans is half-baked. And to top off the disappointing writing, there were also some disappointing casting choices. Mainly, this problem falls on Gal Gadot's shoulders. She really was not the best choice for the evil queen. Her performance was not menacing or scary. Gal here was just barely getting through these lines. She also wasn't a strong singer. Luckily, we have Rachel Zegler saving us all with her performance. She is a stunning singer. Thank goodness they hired a good singer for this princess. Rachel does tend to have a more musical theater delivery, but she is a Broadway girl first, and this is a sort of musical theater-y movie, so it wasn't too distracting. I do have one note, which is I do think that her mannerisms are too strong for Snow White, but I mostly blame the direction and the writing for this because they wrote a bolder Snow White. So I think this is really a combination problem and not solely Rachel's fault. Obviously, there was a lot of controversy with her casting choice, and I will not be unpacking that discussion today, but I do at least like that they tried to make this casting make sense for the story. So instead of Snow White being named after her snow white skin, it's because she was born in a snowstorm. Andrew Burnap played Jonathan as the reworked prince, and he was fine. I think the only thing that comes to mind with him is that he just looked so much older than Rachel, which was very odd given the age rumors of the movie, where the prince is like 29 and Snow White's only 14. I don't know where that rumor comes from, but it was kind of odd to cast a guy that looks so much older than her. And then of course there's the weird bandits and the dwarves. Honestly, I can't tell you about the bandits because they're in the movie for 2 seconds. And then the dwarves are all CGI, which completely took me out of the movie, and they did not look great next to actual humans. And then we have the music, which on its own I think is fine, but the biggest problem I have is that it just doesn't sound like Disney or Snow White music. The opening number, Where the Good Things Grow, you could really find it in any musical, and I was really looking for a Snow White influence or an ode to the 1930s or Germany or something. And you can really hear this musical theater influence with Waiting on a Wish, which I think is actually a really pretty song. I love Rachel's voice in this song, but again, it doesn't feel like a Snow White song. Snow White is very gentle and sweet, and this is more of a power ballad. And all of the other new songs I did not like. All is fair. For a villain song, this was not scary or intimidating like a villain song should be. And I think worst of all, it's just completely unnecessary. You could take this out of the movie movie and it wouldn't change the plot, and it doesn't add anything to her character that you don't know already. The only original songs they kept were Whistle While You Work and Hi-Ho and the Silly Song, and Whistle While You Work and Hi-Ho were probably my favorite parts of the movie. And then on top of the uninspired music, we also have the uninspired visuals. I have no idea how this movie was so expensive. It was around $250 million, and that means it is one of the most expensive remakes Disney has done. And I just don't know where all this money went. It's so sad because the original has such beautiful cell animation, and the animators actually had to spend a significant amount of time to learn about human anatomy so that it looked more realistic. And I wish I could say that the same care and dedication was applied here. Maybe it was, but I just don't see it. Even the shots that are a direct copy and paste from the animation just feel a little bit lazy. And I hate to be harsh here, but when you look at something like Cinderella, they put their own spin on the iconic moments. Like the dress and the ballroom, they're not exact replicas of the animation. And in terms of the overall production design, it just feels like every other Disney remake, where the sets and the costumes kind of have that plasticky party city vibe to them. I actually thought that the cottage set was really beautiful, but that's the only one. The rest of the sets were just so generic. Like the castle, I think, had one room. The wishing well, I don't know, it just looked like it was made out of styrofoam. The village was like one tiny set, and it looked exactly like the Beauty and the Beast village. But I did really love the homage to the storybook in the beginning. I thought the book itself was really beautiful, and there was this cool animation effect that happened as the book turned into live action, which I thought was kind of a cool way to blend the 2D and the live action together. That said, I could do without the CGI animals, which on that note, there was so much CGI. It almost felt like there were scenes that just looked entirely CGI. And I think this brings up a point which a lot of people are starting to bring up, which is at what point do these remakes even become live actions if everything is just animated realistically? And lastly with these visuals is, of course, the purely villainous costume design. If we just look at Snow White, she has 3 looks. Not one of them is pretty, and she is a princess. They all have that sort of cheap party city dress look to them, which just does not look like it's made for a movie. It looks like it's made to be on a toy. I think the most sinful of these outfits is her iconic yellow dress. Everything about this dress I don't like. I was watching the behind the scenes, and they said that they had chose this color palette to better suit Rachel. So that's why these colors are warmer. So the blue is more of like a warmer greenish blue, and the yellow is a warmer yellow. However, I actually think that Rachel, according to the color seasons, if you're familiar with that whole school of thought, I think that she's a dark winter, which would mean that cool tones look better on her. And she does still look good in warmer toned colors, but it's the darker, cool toned ones that look really striking. And so I would argue that you could have kept her in the cool tone blue and yellow. But I think the worst part of this dress is the style of it. I really do not like the straight across bodice. I just think that the straight across makes it look like a children's dress. I also really don't like the short length. There's just something about this that just doesn't feel princess. I do like that they gave her flats, but I wish they were yellow flats with little bows. Then on top of the poor costume design for Rachel, she also has unflattering makeup and hair. Why are her lips pink? Should they not be red? I also feel like she should have had some blush as an ode to the animation because they used actual makeup on Snow White to give her those rosy red cheeks. But then we have the most egregious part of this whole look, which is her hair. It gets worse the more you look at it. I can't believe they gave her this wig. I truly can't. I still can't get over it. Rachel is so stunning, and this wig just is an insult. I just don't understand how they're bringing an animation to life, and they made Gal Gadot look like the evil queen, and you couldn't even give Rachel the same hairstyle. Speaking of the evil queen, I also thought her dresses were so underwhelming. I actually thought she was wearing the same dress in every scene because they looked so similar. She's supposed to be so vain and obsessed with jewels, and I don't know where the luxury and the lavishness is in her costumes. I always pictured the evil queen in this rich velvet, and I wish there was at least one costume that looked like that. Even worse, we can compare Snow White to the live action Cinderella, which was shot on a $90 million budget. That's $200 million less. And oh my gosh, is this movie not the most beautiful movie? The castle is grand and luxurious. Every shot is so beautiful. The sets are so detailed. I have a whole video talking about how beautiful this movie is, and I'm so serious. You should go watch it because you're gonna be so depressed at like what the live actions have become. Although let's be honest, this was really like the only good live action, but this compared to this Snow White is just, there is no comparison. I really don't understand this because the same costume designer, Sandy Powell, also designed Cinderella's costumes, which are phenomenal. It's also weird because Mark Webb, who is the director, directed 500 Days of Summer, which is an amazing movie, and I don't know how he made that and then this. So maybe it's not the people making the movies that are to blame. Maybe it's someone at like Disney headquarters that's making them do this. But it's just so sad when you think back to how Walt Disney believed in Snow White so much when he was making it that he mortgaged his own house to finish funding production. And look at what that risk gave him, plus the risk of making a feature-length animation when that had never been done before. By prioritizing good storytelling and pouring so much passion into his work, Disney made so much fantastic movies and impacted so many of our childhoods. Fast forward to today, all Disney makes now are the same safe choices. They never take any risks, only remaking what's already been done before, and they don't even have the decency to respect the original version. I think this whole thing is so ironic because while Snow White was in production, no one believed in this movie. They all referred to it as, quote, Disney's folly, only for it to be a tremendous success when it released. 90 years later, and they somehow made a known successful story into Disney's folly and produced one of their worst flops for a live-action remake. I think this movie is just the essence of villainy that Waltz really wanted to avoid. Is this the worst movie ever made? Definitely not. But it's also really disappointing. I think out of all of the princess remakes, the only worst one might be Mulan. Snow White isn't going to bankrupt the company or anything, but I really hope that Disney gets the message and stops these remakes. At the very least, do not make that Tangled live action. I hope someone at Disney has seen my video because we all know how I feel about that. Shout out to the 5 people that really wanted me to make that Dune costume design video that I talked about at the end of my last video that I like wrote a whole script for and then abandoned. I don't know if that's ever gonna happen, but here is another little Easter egg for you if you're still watching this video. Those are my thoughts on the Snow White live action. I'd love to know what you think. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Anyway, I hope you guys have a lovely night. Don't take any apples from strangers. And thank you so much for watching.